In the scorching heat of the North African desert, where the sun bleached bones and baked the earth into a cracked wasteland, an unlikely hero emerged from the shadows of its more famous counterparts. The Hawker Hurricane, often overshadowed by the sleeker Spitfire in the skies over Britain, found its true calling among the sand dunes and rocky outcrops of Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. This was a plane that many had written off as obsolescent, yet, in the vast theater of desert warfare, it would prove that reputation wrong in the most spectacular fashion. As Axis and Allied forces clashed across the harsh terrain of North Africa between 1940 and 1943, the Hurricane transformed from an aging fighter into the versatile warrior of the desert, a forgotten hero that would ultimately rule the desert skies through sheer versatility and rugged determination. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The Hurricane's journey to desert dominance began not with triumph, but with necessity. By June 1940, as Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany following the fall of France, the Royal Air Force faced an impossible equation. The Battle of Britain loomed on the horizon, and every modern fighter was needed to defend the home islands. Yet thousands of miles away across the Mediterranean, British forces in Egypt faced a growing Italian threat with practically no air cover. The decision was made to send what could be spared, and what could be spared were Hurricanes, already being superseded by Spitfires in fighter command. On August 2, 1940, as summer heat shimmered across the Egyptian desert, the aircraft carrier HMS Argus launched the first contingent of Hurricanes toward Malta, from where they would fly on to Egypt. Flight Lieutenant Peter Wycombe Barnes, who would later become one of the desert's leading aces, recalled the moment. "We were told we were going to the Middle East, which might as well have been the moon for all we knew about it. Our Hurricanes had been tropicalized as best they could, but nobody really knew what awaited us in that environment. What awaited them was a theater of war unlike any other. The North African desert presented challenges that would have broken lesser aircraft. Temperatures soared to 120°F in the shade, while sandstorms could strip paint from metal surfaces in minutes. The fine dust infiltrated everything. Engines, cockpits, instruments, and maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the fighters operational. Squadron leader James Ginger Lewis of 274 Squadron wrote in his diary, "The sand is our true enemy here. It's in our food, our clothes, our beds, and most worryingly, in our engines. We've taken to wrapping the Hurricane's engines in old bed sheets when not flying, like mummifying the dead." Yet, remarkably, the Hurricane's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire, proved surprisingly resilient to these conditions. Its simple construction and accessibility made field repairs possible with limited resources, while its wide-track undercarriage proved ideal for rough desert airstrips that were often little more than flattened patches of sand. The Hurricane's baptism of fire in the desert came during the opening phases of Operation Compass in December 1940, Britain's first major offensive against Italian forces. The Regia Aeronautica, Italy's air force, flew a mixture of Fiat CR-42 biplanes and Machi C-200 fighters, neither of which could match the Hurricane's speed or firepower. On December 12, 1940, Hurricanes of 274 and 73 squadrons intercepted a large formation of Italian bombers escorted by CR-42s near Sidi Barrani. In the ensuing dogfight, the Hurricanes shot down 8 Italian aircraft without loss. Flight Lieutenant John Lapsley recalled, "The Italians were brave but outclassed. Their biplanes were more maneuverable, but we had the speed to dictate the terms of engagement. We'd make a firing pass, then climb away before they could respond. It was almost unfair." By February 1941, British forces had advanced 500 miles into Libya, capturing nearly 130,000 Italian prisoners and destroying hundreds of aircraft. The hurricane had established its first claim to desert mastery, but the war in North Africa was about to change dramatically. In February 1941, the first units of the German Africa Corps under General Erwin Rommel arrived in Libya. With them came the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter units flying the formidable Messerschmitt Bf 109E, a fighter that outclassed the Hurricane in most performance categories. Suddenly, the Hurricane pilots found themselves on the defensive. The Bf 109E could outclimb, outdive, and usually outrun the Hurricane, forcing RAF pilots to develop new tactics. Wing Commander Paddy Finucane, who arrived in Egypt in March 1941, developed what became known as the Beaufighter Sandwich, a tactic where Hurricanes would lure Bf 109s into attacking, only to find Bristol Beaufighters waiting above to pounce. "We used the Hurricane's one advantage, its turning circle," Finucane wrote in a letter home. A 109 trying to follow a Hurricane in a tight turn would often stall or lose so much energy that they became vulnerable. "We learned to fly defensively, to make them fight on our terms." The arrival of German forces coincided with another significant development, the Hurricane's evolution into a fighter bomber. RAF planners realized that the Hurricane's 8 machine gun armament, while devastating against aircraft, lacked the punch needed for ground attack. Modified Hurricanes began appearing with bomb racks capable of carrying 2 250-pound bombs, while others were fitted with 40mm anti-tank cannons under the wings. These tank busters, nicknamed flying can openers by their pilots, would become one of the most feared weapons in the Desert War. Flight Sergeant Ray Hanna described his first attack on an Africa Corps convoy. "I came in at treetop height, though there were no trees in that God-forsaken place. The cannon shells could punch through the top armor of a Panzer IV where it was thinnest. When those 40mm shells hit, you'd see a flash inside the tank, and then often the ammunition would cook off. It was a terrible way to die, but we reminded ourselves of what they'd do to our boys if they broke through." The Hurricane's versatility became its greatest strength, particularly after the introduction of the Hurricane Minke 20D with its lethal 40mm cannons. While pure fighters like the Bf 109 and later Spitfires focused on air superiority, the Hurricane evolved into the Desert War's primary ground attack aircraft. A German intelligence report captured in July 1942 noted, "The Hurricane presents a significant threat to our armored formations when they operate beyond the range of our flak units. Their pilots exhibit remarkable courage, attacking at extremely low altitudes. Each Hurricane destroyed should be counted as equivalent to the elimination of several tanks." This versatility extended beyond tank busting. Hurricanes served as bomber escorts, reconnaissance platforms, and even impromptu transport aircraft when their rear fuselage fabric was modified to carry crucial medical supplies to forward units. The human element of the Hurricane's Desert War often goes unmentioned in technical histories. The cockpit of a Hurricane in the desert was an environment of almost unimaginable discomfort. Without air conditioning, temperatures could reach 140 degrees inside the plexiglass canopy. Pilots flew wearing as little as possible, often just shorts and a light shirt, under their Mae West life preservers. They drank salt tablets dissolved in water to replace electrolytes, lost through constant sweating. Squadron leader Jeffrey Wellham wrote, "You'd land after a 2-hour patrol and have to be helped from the cockpit, your flying suit drenched as if you'd been swimming. Your eyes would burn from the sweat and the glare, and you'd do it all again a few hours later." Yet, despite these hardships, the Hurricane pilots developed a special affection for their aircraft. Its forgiving handling characteristics and ability to absorb battle damage made it a trusted partner in a hostile environment where reliability meant survival. As 1942 progressed, the war in North Africa reached its climax. Rommel's Africa Corps pushed to within 60 miles of Alexandria during the summer, threatening to capture the Suez Canal and cut Britain's vital supply route to its eastern empire. At this critical juncture, Hurricane squadrons were thrown into the battle with desperate intensity. During the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, Hurricane fighter bombers flew up to 5 sorties per day, attacking German and Italian armor, supply columns, and troop concentrations. Wing Commander Victor Beamish described the pace. The ground crews worked miracles. Aircraft would return riddled with holes and covered in oil, and somehow they'd have them ready to go again within hours. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then got up and continued. The Hurricane, thankfully, was designed to be maintained under precisely such conditions. Any other aircraft would have fallen apart under the strain. The tide of war turned at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, when General Bernard Montgomery's Eighth Army finally broke through Axis lines. Hurricanes played a crucial role, with the tank-busting Mk-RIDs claiming dozens of Axis tanks and hundreds of other vehicles during the battle and subsequent pursuit. Flight Lieutenant David Becker recalled, "We'd fly so low, you could see the expressions on the faces of the German tank crews. They learned to fear the sight of hurricanes coming in low against the sun. Some would abandon their vehicles when they spotted us, diving into the sand for what little protection it offered." By November, the Axis forces were in full retreat across Libya. Hurricane squadrons leapfrogged forward, establishing new airstrips just hours after the front line had passed, maintaining constant pressure on the retreating forces. The Hurricane's dominance of the desert skies reached its zenith during the Tunisia campaign of 1942-43. By this stage, many Hurricane units had been re-equipped with newer aircraft such as the Spitfire Mk-Phi and the American P-40 Kitty Hawk, but the Hurricane remained the backbone of RAF tactical operations. Its role had fully evolved from day fighter to ground attack specialist. Air Vice Marshal Arthur Conyngham, commander of the Desert Air Force, told war correspondents, "The Hurricane has been the most versatile aircraft of this campaign. When military historians write about the Desert War, they will note that while the Spitfire may have won the Battle of Britain, it was the Hurricane that won the Battle of North Africa." This assessment was shared by the enemy. Captured Luftwaffe pilot Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stated during interrogation, "We feared your Spitfires in air-to-air combat, but it was the Hurricanes that made our lives most difficult. They seemed to be everywhere, attacking our columns, our airfields, our supply dumps. One never knew when they would appear, skimming the desert floor below radar coverage." Beyond the technical and tactical aspects, the Hurricane's desert war was defined by the men who flew it. The Desert Air Force brought together pilots from across the British Empire and occupied Europe. British, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Canadians, Rhodesians, Free French, and Poles all flew Hurricanes over the North African battlefields. Squadron leader Clive Caldwell, Australia's leading ace of the war with 28.5 confirmed victories, many scored in Hurricanes, embodied the aggressive spirit of these desert pilots. After one engagement in which he shot down 5 Italian aircraft despite being wounded, he remarked, "The Hurricane isn't the fastest or most agile fighter, but it's stable as a rock, as a gun platform. If you can get into position, those 8 Brownings will tear anything apart." This multinational character of the Hurricane squadrons reflected the global nature of the conflict and created a unique fighting culture. Polish pilots, already veterans of their own country's defeat and the Battle of Britain, brought particular intensity to the desert campaign. Flight Lieutenant John Zumbach of 303 Squadron wrote, "The desert was yet another foreign battlefield for us, but the cause remained the same. We had seen what the Germans did to Poland, then to France. Africa was simply another front in our personal war against fascism." The Hurricane's influence extended beyond military outcomes to the very character of desert warfare. The constant threat of air attack forced Axis forces to move primarily at night and to disperse during daylight hours, significantly slowing their operational tempo. German field commanders complained bitterly about the omnipresent Jabos, fighter bombers that made daylight movement nearly suicidal during periods of Allied air superiority. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself wrote in his papers, "The British had air superiority and made full use of it. Their fighter bombers were our most dangerous opponents." The soldier's morale is most severely tested when he has to endure bombing and strafing without being able to fight back. This psychological impact was as important as the physical damage inflicted. Hurricane pilots understood this dimension of their work. Wing Commander Percy "Laddie" Lucas noted, "We knew that for every tank or truck we destroyed, we were affecting the morale of hundreds of enemy soldiers. When you have to scan the skies constantly, when you can't move or resupply during daylight, when your comrades are being killed around you from attacks you cannot prevent, that's when armies begin to break." As the North African campaign drew to a close in May 1943 with the Axis surrender in Tunisia, the Hurricane was already being phased out in favor of newer types. Yet its legacy in the Desert War was secure. From Egypt to Tunisia, across 2,000 miles of some of the harshest terrain on Earth, the Hurricane had evolved from an outdated fighter to become the most versatile combat aircraft in the theater. Its operational record was staggering. Hurricane squadrons had destroyed over 1,500 enemy aircraft in North Africa, damaged or destroyed over 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and countless thousands of soft-skinned vehicles, supply dumps, and other targets. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, who commanded RAF Middle East during much of the campaign, summarized the Hurricane's contribution. "The Hurricane in the desert was like the proverbial Swiss Army knife, not perhaps the best at any one thing, but capable of doing almost everything we asked of it, and doing it reliably in conditions that would have grounded more sophisticated aircraft." The human cost of this achievement was equally significant. Of the approximately 4,500 Hurricane pilots who served in the North African campaign, more than 300 were killed in action or died in accidents. Hundreds more were wounded or became prisoners of war. Ground crews worked heroic hours in appalling conditions to keep the aircraft flying, often with inadequate spares and improvised solutions. Squadron leader Thomas Neal, who served both in the Battle of Britain and North Africa, reflected years later, "The Spitfire may have captured the public imagination, but Hurricane pilots knew they were flying something special too. There was a workmanlike quality to the Hurricane that suited the Desert War. Not flashy, not perfect, but dependable and effective. The perfect tool for an imperfect environment." This sentiment was echoed by Ground Chief Mechanic Sergeant James McIndoe, who maintained Hurricanes throughout the campaign. "They weren't pretty by the end, patched, repaired, modified with whatever we had on hand. But they kept flying. You'd patch a fuel tank with chewing gum and fabric if that's what it took to get another sortie." As Allied forces moved on to Sicily and Italy, in the summer of 1943, the Hurricane's role in the Mediterranean theater diminished. Newer, more capable aircraft took its place on the front lines, while the veteran Hurricanes were relegated to training units or sent to secondary fronts. Yet, in the deserts of North Africa, the Hurricane had found its moment of glory, transforming from an aircraft fighting for relevance into the versatile master of a crucial theater of war. The legacy of the Desert Hurricanes lived on in the tactical doctrines developed during the campaign, particularly in close air support techniques that would prove vital during the later campaigns in Europe. Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst, who commanded 83 Group during the Normandy campaign, explicitly credited the desert experience. "Everything we accomplished with tactical air power in Northwest Europe was built on foundations laid in the desert, often by Hurricane squadrons. The techniques of armed reconnaissance, tank busting, forward air control, all were developed to maturity in North Africa." For the pilots who survived, the desert campaign left indelible memories. Group Captain Sir Hugh Cocky Dundas, who began his combat career flying Hurricanes in the desert before later commanding Spitfire wings, wrote in his memoirs, "The desert stripped everything to its essentials. There was no room for pretense or artifice. The Hurricane, in many ways, embodied that spirit. Straightforward, honest, effective. Not the most elegant solution, perhaps, but the right one for that time and place. I've flown better aircraft, but none that I trusted more completely. This special relationship between pilot and machine was common among hurricane veterans. The aircraft's forgiving handling characteristics and structural toughness created a bond of trust that more temperamental fighters couldn't match. As Flight Lieutenant Peter Brothers put it, you could throw a hurricane around with impunity. It would protest, certainly, but it wouldn't bite you like a Spitfire might. In combat, that confidence to push the aircraft to its limits without fear of it snapping back at you was invaluable. The Hurricane's Desert War officially ended with Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, in July 1943. By then, the aircraft that had once ruled the desert skies had been surpassed by newer designs better suited to the evolving air war. Yet its contribution to victory in North Africa cannot be overstated. Without the Hurricane's versatility and dependability, the critical campaigns that secured the Mediterranean and protected the Suez Canal might well have ended differently. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, addressing RAF personnel after El Alamein, acknowledged this contribution. Without air superiority, we could not have won this battle. And without your Hurricane squadrons providing close support to my troops, that superiority would have been merely theoretical, rather than the decisive factor it proved to be. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph came from an unlikely source, a captured German panzer officer who, when asked about Allied aircraft, replied, "The Spitfire we respected, the Kitty Hawk we feared, but the Hurricane we hated. It was the one that was always there, the one we could never escape." In the grand narrative of World War II, the Hawker Hurricane's contribution is often condensed to its role in the Battle of Britain, where it shot down more enemy aircraft than all other defenses combined. Yet it was in the deserts of North Africa, far from the white cliffs of Dover, that this sturdy fighter truly came into its own. Adapting to roles its designers never envisioned, surviving in an environment that tested both man and machine to their limits, the Hurricane proved that versatility and reliability could be as valuable as raw performance. The forgotten hero of the desert skies may have ended the war overshadowed by more glamorous aircraft, but for the armies that fought beneath its protective umbrella and the pilots who guided it through the desert air, the Hurricane's contribution was anything but forgotten. In the crucible of the North African campaign, an aging fighter found its second wind and wrote its name indelibly into the history of aerial warfare. As the war progressed beyond North Africa, the Hurricane's operational history continued in other theaters, particularly in the Mediterranean and Burma. After proving its worth in the desert, the Hurricane was deployed to the jungles and mountains of Burma, where it faced yet another extreme environment. Group Captain Percy Laddie Lucas, who had commanded Hurricane squadrons in both theaters, noted the aircraft's remarkable adaptability. From sand to jungle, from scorching heat to monsoon rains, the Hurricane simply kept flying. We joked that you could probably operate it from an iceberg if you had to, and some poor chap in the Aleutians probably did just that. In Burma, the Hurricane continued its evolution as a ground attack aircraft, supporting the legendary Chindits and other Allied forces fighting against Japanese occupation. Squadron leader David Innes recalled, "The jungle canopy presented challenges the desert never did. You couldn't see your targets as clearly, and navigation was infinitely more difficult without the horizon visible for miles. But the Hurricane's stability made it an ideal platform for the low-level attacks we specialized in." While the Hurricane's combat career would continue until the war's end, particularly in secondary theaters, its golden age had been the Desert Campaign. It was there, against the odds, that an aircraft designed for the green fields of England had proven its worth in an environment that could not have been more different. The Hurricane's desert legacy is perhaps best summarized by Air Commodore Raymond Collishaw, who commanded RAF units in the early desert campaigns. "The Hurricane wasn't just an aircraft in the desert, It was a lifeline. For ground troops pinned down by enemy fire, the sight of hurricanes sweeping in meant salvation. For enemy columns, it meant terror. The hurricane may not have won the war single-handedly, but there were days in the desert when it certainly prevented us from losing it. The technical evolution of the hurricane throughout the desert campaign represented some of the most innovative aircraft modifications of the war. Starting with the basic Mark I, the Hurricane underwent numerous field modifications to adapt to desert conditions. Sand filters, known as Vaux filters, were fitted to the air intakes to prevent the fine desert dust from destroying the Merlin engines. These reduced performance, but were an essential compromise. Wing Commander Thomas Pike noted, "We'd sacrifice about 15 bpm in top speed with the filters fitted, but without them, engine life could be measured in hours rather than weeks." Tropical radiators were installed to cope with the extreme heat, along with enhanced oil coolers. Perhaps most innovative were the field modifications made by the RAF's innovative Desert Air Force maintenance units. Flying Officer Michael Rowan, an engineering officer, described their work. "We'd use whatever materials we could scrounge. Canvas from damaged aircraft became makeshift engine covers. We fabricated dust shields from flattened fuel drums. One particularly clever sergeant created improved oil seals using rubber from discarded Wellington bomber tires. It was engineering by necessity, and it kept those hurricanes flying when, by all rights, they should have been grounded." The Hurricane's transformation into a tank buster represented another leap in tactical innovation. The Mark IID variant, armed with two 40mm Vickers-S guns, entered service in the desert in early 1942. These cannon were adapted from anti-aircraft guns and had never been intended for air-to-ground use. Their installation required significant structural reinforcement to the Hurricane's wings and changed the aircraft's handling characteristics dramatically. Flight Lieutenant Peter Wykeham described flying the IID. "It was like flying with two lampposts strapped under your wings." The recoil when firing both cannon was tremendous. The aircraft would actually slow noticeably. Aiming required a completely different technique from machine guns. You had to allow for the relatively slow muzzle velocity and significant projectile drop. Despite these challenges, Hurricane IID pilots developed remarkable accuracy. During trials, experienced pilots could consistently hit targets just 4 feet square from attack heights of 200 feet. This precision made the Hurricane IID the most feared anti-tank aircraft in the theater until the arrival of the rocket-armed Typhoons in 1944. The cultural impact of the Hurricane on the Desert War extended beyond military operations. The aircraft became a symbol of British persistence during the darkest days of the North African campaign. When Rommel's forces seemed unstoppable in 1942, pushing toward Alexandria and threatening the Suez Canal, Hurricane squadrons continued operating from forward airfields, often within miles of the advancing German armor. This visible presence boosted civilian morale throughout Egypt and the Middle East at a critical juncture. Cairo newspapers regularly featured stories of hurricane pilots and their exploits. Egyptian businessman Farouk Abaza recalled in his memoirs, "Even when the British Army seemed to be in constant retreat, their aircraft remained in our skies." The distinctive shape of the Hurricane became a reassurance that the Allies had not abandoned us to Axis occupation. This psychological dimension was equally important for Allied ground forces. New Zealand Infantry Sergeant James McPherson wrote home, "When you're dug in and under fire, nothing lifts the spirits like the sound of hurricanes coming in." You'd hear that Merlin engine note, then see them skimming the desert floor toward the German positions, and suddenly your whole outlook would change. They reminded us we weren't alone. The maintenance miracle that kept hurricanes flying in the desert deserves special recognition. Operating from primitive forward airstrips with minimal infrastructure, ground crews performed near impossible feats of improvisation. Chief Mechanic Warrant Officer Stanley Wilkins described their working conditions. "We'd service aircraft in sandstorms that stripped skin from exposed hands. Temperatures inside aircraft fuselages could reach 160 degrees. You couldn't touch metal parts without gloves. We'd work through the night by vehicle headlights because the days were too hot. Water was so scarce that we sometimes used urine to top up radiators in emergencies. These ground crews developed techniques specific to desert operations. Aircraft were always parked facing into the wind to minimize sand ingestion. Engine oil was changed twice as frequently as specified in official maintenance schedules. Improvised dust covers were fitted to every opening when aircraft weren't flying. Perhaps most impressively, these maintenance units achieved remarkable mobility, able to pack up an entire operational airfield and move forward to a new location within hours, keeping pace with the rapid advances after El Alamein. The hurricane's opponents in the Desert Air War offer another perspective on its effectiveness. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to the technical superiority of their Bf-109s, often underestimated the hurricane, sometimes fatally. Hauptmann Hans Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa, who claimed 158 victories before his death in 1942, respected the hurricane's capabilities. The British desert pilots flew aggressively, especially in hurricanes. They understood the aircraft's limitations and strengths perfectly. A hurricane that suckered you into a turning fight was extremely dangerous. Their 8 machine guns created a lethal cone of fire that could tear a 109 apart in seconds if you got careless. Italian pilots flying the obsolescent Fiat CR-42 biplane and later the Machi C-202 faced an even more difficult challenge against the hurricane. Colonel Angelo Boscolo of the Regia Aeronautica noted after the war, "The hurricane was a formidable opponent for us, particularly before we received the Machi. Its concentrated firepower was devastating against our aircraft, which were often lighter and less well armored. Many Italian pilots developed a healthy respect for the hurricane and would break off combat rather than engage one on unfavorable terms." The hurricane's contribution to major turning points in the Desert Campaign is often underappreciated in conventional histories. During the crucial Battle of Alam el Halfa in late August 1942, Rommel's final attempt to break through to Alexandria before El Alamein, Hurricane fighter bombers played a decisive role in blunting the German offensive. The battle marked the first implementation of Montgomery's new defensive strategy, with British forces dug in on the Alam el Halfa ridge, while mobile forces and air power attacked the German flanks and supply lines. Hurricane squadrons flew over 780 sorties in just 4 days, dropping more than 90 tons of bombs and firing hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition at Axis forces. German records captured after the war revealed the impact. Fuel shortages caused by hurricane attacks forced Rommel to abandon the offensive earlier than planned. Panzer Commander General Wilhelm von Thoma reported to Berlin, "Our supply columns were under constant air attack. Many fuel trucks were destroyed, and drivers became reluctant to move during daylight. This fuel shortage critically limited our operational mobility precisely when we needed it most." The battle marked a crucial psychological turning point, the moment when Rommel's aura of invincibility was broken, setting the stage for the more famous victory at El Alamein months later. The hurricane pilots themselves represented the multinational character of the Allied war effort. Beyond the British, Commonwealth, and European contingents, American volunteers also flew hurricanes in the desert before the official U.S. entry into the war. One of these was Flight Lieutenant James Earthquake Magoon McGovern, who flew with 261 Squadron in Egypt before later joining the Flying Tigers in China. McGovern's colorful assessment captured the hurricane's essence. "It wasn't the fastest horse in the stable, but it could take a hell of a beating and still bring you home. I once landed a hurricane with over 200 bullet holes and part of the rudder missing. Try that in a 109, and you'd be writing your memoirs on a heavenly cloud." This diversity of backgrounds created a unique flying culture in the desert hurricane squadrons. South African pilot Adolf Sailor Malan introduced innovative combat tactics derived from his experiences in the Battle of Britain. Australian and New Zealand pilots brought a characteristic informal approach to discipline while maintaining exceptional professional standards in the air. Polish and Czech pilots, fighting for homelands under Nazi occupation, approached each mission with particular intensity. This melting pot of combat experience and national flying styles created what Air Commodore Raymond Collishaw called the most effective tactical air force of its size in the world at that time. The Hurricane's armament evolved significantly during the Desert Campaign, reflecting its changing role. The early Mark I aircraft arrived with the standard 8 to 303-inch Browning machine guns, an armament that proved adequate against Italian aircraft, but increasingly marginal against well-armored German targets. As the Hurricane transitioned to ground attack, various experimental weapon fits were tried. The Mark II IC introduced 4 20mm Hispano cannon, which offered much greater destructive power against both air and ground targets. Wing Commander Adrian Boyd recalled their effectiveness. The 20mm cannon would tear chunks off enemy aircraft rather than just punching small holes. Against ground targets, they could penetrate light armor and destroy trucks with just a few rounds. Perhaps the most unusual armament experiment was the Gun Pod Hurricane, tested by 6th Squadron in mid-1941. This modification mounted a single 40mm Vickers S gun in a pod under each wing, creating what would evolve into the Mark II-D. Test pilot Flight Lieutenant Humphrey Gilbert described his first firing trials. "The recoil was so severe that I thought the wings might come off. The aircraft yawed dramatically with each shot. But when we examined the target afterward and saw those massive holes punched clean through steel plate, we knew we had a game-changer for anti-tank work." By late 1942, some Hurricanes were also equipped with rails for 3-inch rockets, adding yet another weapon to their already impressive arsenal. The human cost of the Hurricane's Desert Campaign was substantial. Flying in an open cockpit in desert conditions brought unique physical challenges. Pilots suffered from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and salt depletion on a regular basis. Medical Officer Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Page documented the physical toll. Pilots would lose up to 10 pounds of water weight during a single long mission. Eyes became inflamed from the combination of sun glare, dust, and sweat. Skin cancer rates were alarmingly high among long-serving desert aircrews. We prescribed salt tablets, enforced fluid intake, and issued the best sunglasses we could find, but the environment took its toll regardless. Beyond these physical challenges, the psychological stress was equally severe. Unlike the Battle of Britain, where pilots could return to comfortable quarters each evening, desert airfields offered minimal comforts. Tented accommodations, limited water for washing, monotonous rations, and the constant presence of flies, scorpions, and other desert fauna created an environment where rest was difficult. Yet morale remained surprisingly high. Squadron leader Thomas Pugh attributed this to the unique camaraderie. We were all in it together, officers and enlisted men alike, living in the same conditions, facing the same hardships. There was very little of the class distinction you might find in UK-based squadrons. When you're all equally filthy, equally exhausted, and equally at risk, artificial barriers tend to disappear. The tactical innovations developed by Hurricane squadrons would influence air power doctrine for decades after the war. The concept of cab rank close air support, where aircraft would orbit near the battlefield ready to be called in by forward air controllers as needed, was pioneered by Hurricane squadrons in the Western Desert. Air Vice Marshal Arthur Conyngham and General Bernard Montgomery formalized the command and control systems for this tactical air support, creating what historian Richard Overy called the most sophisticated integration of air and ground forces yet seen in warfare. Forward air control teams, equipped with special radio vehicles and staffed by pilots temporarily assigned from operational squadrons, coordinated strikes with unprecedented precision. Flight Lieutenant Michael Weaver, who served as a FAC during the El Alamein offensive, described the process. "We'd move with the forward infantry. identifying targets of opportunity and calling in the hurricanes. The pilots knew exactly what information they needed: target type, location, defenses, and wind direction for their attack run. A good FAC and experienced hurricane pilots could put bombs within 50 yards of friendly troops, remarkable precision for the technology of the time. These techniques would be refined further during the Italian campaign and ultimately reach full maturity during the Normandy landings and subsequent European operations in 1944-45. The hurricane's legacy in the Desert War ultimately extended beyond the immediate military outcomes to influence the broader strategic conduct of the war. The demonstrated effectiveness of tactical air power in North Africa shaped Allied planning for subsequent campaigns, particularly the emphasis on achieving air superiority before major ground operations. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who first observed these principles in action during Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landings in Northwest Africa in November 1942, became a strong advocate for integrated air-ground operations. In his memoirs, he specifically credited the Desert Air Force's hurricane squadrons. What impressed me most about the British 8th Army's air support was their seamless integration of aerial firepower with ground maneuver. The hurricane pilots had developed this into a fine art through hard experience. Many of the lessons we applied in Normandy and beyond were first learned by hurricane pilots flying from dusty airstrips in Egypt and Libya. This doctrinal influence represented perhaps the hurricane's most enduring contribution to military history, the proof that properly employed tactical air power could fundamentally reshape the battlefield equation. As the North African campaign concluded in May 1943 with the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia, the hurricane's desert story reached its natural conclusion as well. Though the aircraft would serve on in other theaters until the war's end, it was in the vast, harsh expanses of North Africa that it had written its most impressive chapter. From Egypt to Tunisia, across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, the hurricane had evolved from an aircraft fighting for relevance into the versatile master of a critical theater. As newer, more advanced types took over the frontline duties, the veterans of the Desert Hurricane squadrons carried their experiences forward. Many would command Typhoon and Tempest wings during the liberation of Europe, applying the hard-won lessons of desert air warfare to new challenges. Others would return to their home countries after the war, shaping the development of new national air forces with the doctrines and techniques forged in the crucible of the Desert Campaign. The hurricane itself would rapidly fade from operational service after 1945, its rugged, fabric-covered fuselage appearing increasingly anachronistic in the dawning jet age. Yet for those who had flown and maintained the hurricane in the Desert War, its legacy remained indelible. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Conyngham, addressing a reunion of Desert Hurricane pilots in 1955, perhaps best captured this legacy. "Gentlemen, we flew many aircraft in many theaters during that long conflict, but it was the hurricane in the desert that taught us the true potential of air power, not merely to destroy the enemy's aircraft, but to become a decisive force on the battlefield itself. The lessons you learned and the techniques you pioneered changed the very nature of warfare." When history records the development of air power, the hurricane's Desert Campaign will stand as one of its defining chapters. For the forgotten hero that ruled the desert skies, it was a fitting epitaph.